about the inflation surge lately, which is very unpopular rather, and the link between inflation surge and sovereign bond spreads, and consequently the borrowing costs associated with that. Now, I would also investigate borrowing cost reducing strategies within the framework of a simple model, econometric model. So the main issue is inflation surge lately after the COVID-19 and the implications for the emerging market sovereign borrowing costs through interest rate increases and through the actions of the central banks, which aim to reduce eventually inflation and keep it under control. And as I mentioned, I intend to investigate a sovereign borrowing cost reducing strategies based on a simple econometric model of bond yield spreads. So the main points, first, I'm going to provide some stylized facts on inflation surge after COVID-19, on interest rates and risk premia for emerging market sovereign bonds. And then I'm going to introduce borrowing cost reducing strategies for emerging markets sovereign borrowers. And that introduction will be followed by evaluation based on a simple model of emerging market sovereign bond spreads. At the end, there are some recommendations. So let's see some facts about the inflation and the effect of inflation on interest rates. So I take 5-year averages of emerging markets bond yields and I compare them with the value of emerging market bond yields as of 30th of June 2022. So it's some months ago, but still gives you the impression. So there are more than 2 percentage points increase in emerging markets bond yields during 2022. And I compare also the 5-year averages of a US government 10-year treasury yields, which is a measure of credit risk-free interest rate. You can see that there is a 1 percentage point increase. So that's the 5-year average, which is more or less 2%. And this is the US government 10-year treasury yield as of 30th of June 2022. So 1 percentage point increase above the 5-year average, which shows the action of the central bank, of the Federal Reserve. The action saw that to try to keep inflation under control. Now, I can provide some further data explaining the spread on risk-free interest rates using 3 countries, USA, Euro area, and Canada. So you can see that on the left-hand side is measured the inflation rate. On the right-hand side axis is measured monetary policy rate, which is a short-term interest rate in the hands of the central banks. The data start 1 year ago. They are monthly. You can see that till June 2021, there was an increase in inflation. But still, the central banks didn't do anything. They considered that as a temporary phenomenon. Now, later on, inflation continued increasing for all 3 areas. And still, you can see that the green thing is the interest rate of the Federal Reserve, and it didn't do anything. The same goes for European Central Bank and Canada. So at this stage, they continue to consider inflation as being temporary. After January 2022, you can see that there is a huge increase in inflation, and there is also the reaction of the central banks. They increased their policy rates. And obviously, the increase in policy rates implies that eventually the 10-year government, risk-free government bond yields, such as US government yields, will increase as well. And that implies that also the emerging market sovereign spreads will increase, or rather emerging markets interest rates, borrowing costs will increase as well. And so that explains the difference in risk-free rates. Inflation is the main factor there. Now you can see that there is obviously there is a 2 percentage point increase in the yields of emerging markets bonds. Part of it is due to increase in risk-free rate. Part of it is due to increase in risk. So obviously the economies of emerging markets are going to perform less in the inflationary environment. So investments will be depressed and other things will surge, other bad things will surge. So the economies will perform worse, and that implies that the risk premium will increase as well. But one of the main factors, obviously, even here is the inflation. And so I have taken the case of India, Brazil, and Kazakhstan. The same graph, the same setup. Inflation is measured on the left-hand side axis, and the monetary policy reaction, interest rate, is measured on the right-hand side vertical axis. And you can see that these countries, Brazil, India, and Kazakhstan, in line with developed countries, didn't do anything at the initial phase of inflation. Well, with the exception of Brazil, you can see that the rose bar here increases gradually, which means that the Brazilian central bank intervened, increasing interest rates during the second stage. So they were advanced vis-a-vis other countries, vis-a-vis developed and developing countries as well. And during the third stage, you can see a sizable increase for all central banks. So the interest rates increased in tandem after that. Interestingly, Brazil inflation went down at some point, which shows that the early reaction of Brazilian central bank paid off. After several months, inflation in Brazil went to 10% from about 12%. So interest rates have increased in developing and emerging markets as well. So clearly there is an upshift in credit risk-free interest rates by about 1 percentage points till June, but lately it is much higher, the difference. And for emerging market bonds, there is a clear jump in spread from about 3 percentage points to about 4 percentage points. And that jump in spread matches the assumed increase in risk for these economies. Now, the question is, what emerging market sovereign borrowing cost reducing strategy might work given the riskier domestic and global economic situation? Now, as explanatory factors one can use to explain spreads, one can use credit ratings, which are provided by rating agencies. They measure the ability of the borrowers to honor the debt. They consider all factors, possible factors. Now, we claim that there might be some additional factors which explain spread in addition to credit ratings, because sometimes it's observed that credit ratings do not fully go in tandem with spread. So the implication is that it might be a certain other factor which might be useful in explaining sovereign spread. Now, in order to uncover those factors, we take a natural experiment. We consider the case of Albania and North Macedonia borrowing in London market during the COVID-19 pandemic. So North Macedonia borrowed 700 million euros, Albania borrowed 650 million euros. In terms of ratings, North Macedonia had a higher grade than Albania. So other things equal, one would say that North Macedonia would borrow at a lower cost than Albania, which was not the case, actually. North Macedonia borrowed at 3.67%. Albania borrowed at a slightly lower rate, which is 3.625%. Now, according to ratings, it would be the opposite. It is not. So we think that some other factors might work here. One such a factor might be the democracy level. In case of Albania, on June 5th, 2020, there was a political agreement on elections, on the coming elections, and that made the situation much better. Political situation in Albania much better. And another thing is that North Macedonia needed to borrow money so that to refinance, to pay back the maturing debt. Albania needed just 250 million to borrow, but still they opted to borrow 650 million. So from this point of view, Albania was in a better position, better negotiating position than North Macedonia. So these two factors we think might explain the counterintuitive difference in rates, in borrowing costs. And so most of the time, credit ratings explain the sovereign spreads, explain interest rates for sovereign borrowers. However, one can make a case for democracy index. It might be a predictor for future economic developments and eventual credit rating changes. Why? Because if democracy improves, the country can get involved, get engaged in economic reforms. It's easier for the country to implement painful economic reforms so that eventually the ratings will increase. But in the meantime, the country can improve on borrowing costs because investors will, let's say, will pay attention to those developments and might be willing to lend at lower rates for such countries. And you can make a case for external financing needs. If you need to borrow less rather than more, then you are in a better negotiating position with investors, and they can, since you can resort to other options if you need to borrow less. Investors appreciate that, and they lend you at a lower rate. So you are in a better negotiating position. Now, as I told you, I use a simple model developed by KADAREJA and Todry in 2021, and that model explained the spread, the log of spread rather, on the left-hand side, using obviously rating variables, which are taken from Standard & Poor's and are appropriately included in the regression using dummy variable techniques. And in addition, we add democracy index, external financing needs, and we add also the risk-free rate, which measures somehow the willingness of global investors to lend money to emerging markets, sovereign borrowers. As I mentioned, we include dummy variables to take account of differences in ratings in our data set, and we use a dummy for each ratings, and we impose at some point some restrictions on extreme ratings, so that to deal with the limited number of data in our sample. So I'm not going to enter into technicalities anymore. Data are from the spread data from JP Morgan Emerging Market Bond Index. Democracy Index is taken from Economist Intelligence Unit. External financing needs is taken from IMF country reports for each country in our sample. Country ratings are taken from theglobalEconomy.com. As I told you, it's from Standard & Poor's. The data are yearly and cover the 2005-2020 period for Turkey and Hungary, 2005-2013 for Bulgaria, and 2009-2020 for Croatia. Now, since ratings are ordinal numbers, not cardinal numbers, as I told you, we include specific dummies for each ratings, so that to take account of that. But still, since the data available is limited, we have to impose some restrictions for econometric purposes. So we impose some restrictions, and we create a low quality debt and a high quality debt in our sample, but we leave unrestricted the categories BB plus and BBB minus. So for these categories, we are more confident in our results. And so these are descriptions, data descriptive table, and I can show the results. Now, the results look good with regards to credit ratings. They increase gradually, so the spread increases gradually with the deterioration in ratings, which is intuitive and expected. We have also a negative coefficient on democracy index, which means that as you increase democracy level, you would expect investors to lend you money at a slightly lower rate, other things equal. And you have the coefficient on external financing needs to be a positive one, which implies that as you need more money to borrow at some point in time, you would expect to borrow at a slightly higher rate, other things equal, because your negotiating position is weaker. And you have a positive coefficient on the risk-free rate, which in other words says that if interest rates globally increase, like they are doing nowadays, you would expect investors to lend you money at a higher rate, other things equal. Now I'm going to shift this for time consideration purposes. And so I'm going to show you the results, simulation results. So what we do is, based on those coefficients that we estimate, we build the following strategy. We say that suppose that given the situation, difficult economic situation, a country wants to reduce the borrowing costs, and what they can do is improve democracy. It's impossible for them to improve ratings. It takes time, it takes reforms. You cannot improve ratings in a short period of time, and especially during a crisis. So what they can do, we think, is to improve democracy. Let's say a country improves democracy by 5%, as measured by democracy index. So, and let's say the country wants to borrow $10 billion in the market. Other things equal, the effect of that thing, according to the simulations of the model, is that during a crisis period, the country can benefit of $23.3 million less payments on a 10 billion nominal debt value. So that's the effect of improving 5 percentage points, the democracy index. And I guess emerging markets have plenty of room to improve on democracy things. Now, suppose that the country wants to improve on debt management so that not to be exposed to heavy borrowing during crisis periods, for example. If they do that, if they are less needy to borrow money, how much? Well, 5% of GDP less. In that case, if we simulate the model, we figure out that the country can will pay $18.2 million less annually on a 10 billion nominal debt value. So that's the main results of the simulations. So considering the whole thing, countries can improve marginally with respect to borrowing costs by improving on democracy and or by improving on debt management strategies. So those are the main recommendations of this presentation. So in other words, when there is storm outside, you better fix your problems at home. By problems at home, I mean you better improve on democracy, on political understanding, and on law and order. And you can improve also on debt management strategies so that not to be exposed to heavy borrowing during a bad period of time, such as the high inflation period that we are going through right now. And so these are the numbers that I mentioned previously. So I'm not going to repeat them. So if you decrease by 5% the external financing needs, you have to pay less for a $10 billion debt. How much less? 17.7 million. It's not a big thing, but it's still very important, considering that it's done during a crisis period. So that's the presentation. I thank you very much for your attention. And so please ask me questions.
Yeah, Professor Arjan, thank you for your presentation. We have seen different sides of the investment and inflation side. I believe it reflected and grabbed the attention of the common people like me who do not know much about economics, but also the academician specialists, especially with your formula with Mr. Todri. I believe it will also attract some attention towards it because we see people speak on television and other places about we should do this, we should do that, but you put a working mechanism by formula, I believe, which is the solid way to show to answer many questions. Well, I have collected some questions, so if I may, I will ask them.
Okay.
So my first question is more about a global question. Let's say, as we know that the Fed is increasing interest rates, the Mr. Powell bringing 0.75 increase, one another going in a hawkish strike, let's say, on increasing the rates in order to battle with the inflation. As you already shown that many countries only started a couple of months ago, like in April and May, still we do not see any major developments. If we look at US, it was 8.5 and it was 8.6, and the people expect that it will go lower, but it's still resisting. So according to the Brazil example, if we can extrapolate, it looks like we need more time, right, for this system to work.
Yes. Well, measurements of the past have shown that it takes 1 year, more or less, for the monetary policy action today to affect demand in the economy and eventually reduce inflation. So it takes time for monetary policy. And that's why central banks of developed and developing countries as well have done the so-called front loading, which means that I increase several times very frequently by a high amount the interest rates, the policy rates, so that not only to make sure that eventually the inflation will go down by that move, but also to keep inflationary expectations of the private sector under, let's say, to put a ceiling on them, so to make sure that they don't exceed a dangerous level. Because if it does, then no matter how much you increase interest rates, policy interest rates, inflation will go up. So it's inflation result is the result of monetary policy actions, government actions, but also private sector actions, businesses and consumers. If they have high expectations of inflation, no matter what you do on monetary policy level, you cannot keep inflation under control. So front loading is a good strategy. It's painful, but it's good, especially if you react with a delay, as we have seen in the data. There is some delay in reaction. Part of it was because they thought it would be temporary, but eventually it was not temporary. Nowadays, we see that it's going to be there for a long period of time.
Thank you. So I was going to ask next question, but you already answered. Soft approach, as you say, is a more balanced approach because, as you said, inflation is measured and controlled by the real life. What's going in real life? Yeah, you need to take your time. And that point, I want to also jump into the energy topic, as we are aware that due to crisis, let's say in Europe and other parts of the world, mainly due to the energy prices are rising, and it's one of the major factor that spiking the inflation. How do you think that if energy prices will stable in 1 or 2 months, can we see lower inflation rates, or it depends on not only on energy, but also it's just started going up?
Well, it's a good question. Well, what I think is that obviously energy added coal to the fire in 2022 after the conflict in Ukraine. And nowadays, big economic areas are under threat of higher energy costs for a long period of time. But even if the energy goes down for some reason, still inflation will be there because now it's broad-based inflation. It has affected all sectors of the economy. It started from supply chain problems after COVID-19. It continued with the conflict in Ukraine and the increase in energy prices and the increase in wheat prices and other food prices, which followed. And so there are many elements, oil price. Nowadays, we have several animals which affect the basket, consumer basket. And so nowadays, inflation is broad-based. And what makes things worse is that the labor market in several developed countries, such as USA, Canada, are stretched in the sense that there is a very low unemployment rate. So if you have such a problem of increasing inflation, and if you have such a labor market, you would expect wage increases demands to multiply. And so that is going to introduce a round of wage increases, price increases, because businesses are going to, at some point, to charge consumers for the increasing labor costs. So that cycle is very perverse and very difficult to control. Although central banks have increased several times the policy rates, inflation started increasing much earlier. So that is the problem here. So they are behind the curve, the central banks. So this cycle rounds of wage increases and price increases is going to last and is going to reveal that the inflation is going to be longer, especially in countries which have low unemployment rate.
Thank you. And I also could comment that maybe in the case of USA or in general that the responsible authorities or even central banks were possibly afraid to say that we are in recession. That's why they just said, let's wait and see. And this temporary couple of months bring us late regulations, late attempts, and we will possibly see the effects, as you said, from a couple of months from now up to 6 months in order to complete the 1-year circle. One of my last question will be, how healthy do you think the refinancing is? Because during a crisis time, due to certain cuts in the profits or the revenues, people, if they borrowed money, they are refinancing. How do you think this refinancing cycle could go on? And whether this cycle could affect even more inflation in particular and in economies in general, if you have any thoughts.
Well, I think I mentioned something there during my presentation, that there is this problem of supplier willingness to provide credit, which is measured by credit risk-free rates globally. And there is this problem of increasing risk due to high inflation in emerging markets as well. So there are both of these risks. And so because of that, I expect the situation to be much more difficult than in the past, even during COVID-19. During COVID-19, at least, the interest rates in developed countries were zero. And interest rates in developing countries were to their historic lows. So there was no risk of inflation at all. So because of that, we had benign interest rates, so low interest rates for sovereign borrowing. Nowadays, the situation is completely different. So as long as these inflationary pressures continue, I guess both risks will be relevant for sovereign borrowing. And in addition, we can add measures to cope with inflation, protecting consumers, packages which are obviously budget spending. So I expect budget deficits to deteriorate. Because of that, eventually inflation will affect negatively investments. So usual macroeconomic linkages. So eventually economy will perform worse, God forbid. But I think the growth rates will go down globally, and that implies trouble for sovereign borrowers, especially emerging market sovereign borrowers. They suffer from both risks. Obviously, a recession is going to affect sovereign borrowers in developed countries, but those countries have huge financial markets. They enjoy also the safety feature of their currencies, which is relevant during a crisis. And so they can borrow at pretty reasonable rates. Whereas emerging markets have difficulties. I expect difficulties in borrowing, increase in borrowing costs, obviously, as we demonstrated, but an increase, as long as inflation continues, their position will be weaker.
Thank you again for your detailed answer. So, Professor Arjan, we could take your last words and then we could announce this session as closed.
Well, I thank you for the questioning, for the questions, interesting questions. I felt okay, great being here. I thank you for the invitation, for me to have the chance to present, to make a presentation and to discuss with you and answer your questions. It was a great pleasure. I thank you very much. I wish you success in future meetings and conferences.
Thank you very much for your kind words. We're also glad that you accepted our offer and find the time and join us. We are sure, usually I say we are hopefully, but I believe we are sure that our academic cooperation will continue further on in the future. In today's session in our EFE 2022 5th International Economic Finance and Energy Congress, our invited speaker for today, Professor Arjan KADAREJA, delivered a speech from the University of New York, Tirana. Thank you again, and I hope you have a good day and good weekend. Bye-bye.
The same here. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.